here, I've got mine over here. We've got a mock API. So it's going to give us a URL. We have our TDD tutorial. So we can see the base is simply this slash test API / so this is the base. Let's go ahead and create a base. So let me go into utils. I actually want to create a new file. Constant. I'm going to call this const k base URL will be equal to that. So now we can append the base URL and the endpoint. Let's go ahead and do that. So verify that the client.post got called. Verify that it got called the correct URL. And what is the correct URL? The correct URL will be the k base URL / how do we create a user? Create user was / create user, I think. Let me see. If we had users, it would be / create users post. Yes, user. Where is the create user? We just call post users basically. So post users should create our users, our user for us. So we call post users and we pass in the body users data. So post users. So / users. This is our endpoint. You can also go ahead and save the endpoint inside of your remote data source, the actual remote data source. So we can come into our remote data source, and at the top of it, in here, outside of any classes, we can see this const k create user endpoint users, and we can, I spelt constant wrongly. Constant k get users endpoint will be equal to / we had users, what would it be for getting all users? It would simply be / users again, but this time as a post request, as a get request rather. So, but then in your case, you might have different endpoints for these things, so you might want to just do that separately. So over here, we're doing that and we're adding a / no, we already have a / so this time it's a create user endpoint. I think this bit should be in a curly brace to distinguish it. What is the problem? Oh, it wants URI. Yes, I'm so sorry. So we're going to use URI dot pass. So you can actually do this URI dot pass and you can do it that way. When we're doing a get request, I'm going to show you a different way to do this using URIs as well. But then for now, let's just go ahead and use URI.pass. And then for the body, we can actually JSON encode. Remember, the body is expecting a JSON, so we're not going to pass in the raw map. So we want a map where the created at will be equal to the created at that was passed the method call. So we can go ahead and say it's equal to the created at, then the name is equal to name, and the avatar is equal to avatar. Import dot convert, and that should solve that. We make sure that it gets called only once. We don't want to post twice. So this is our post request, and we're sure that that's going to get called. So after that's done, let me save this much. I think this is too long. Yes, that's properly formatted. So we're making sure we're verifying that the client.post got called with the correct URL, and it also got called with the correct body, being that its values were the same as were passed to the function call. Then we verify no more interactions with the client. So we can go ahead and implement this over here. So what are we expecting? We're expecting that whenever this returns the right data, so we're actually gonna go ahead and save this response is equal to, and we're actually sure that its response code is going to be 200 or 201. So let's go ahead and implement it. So where is my implementation? Response will be equal to await a client.post. And what are we posting for? We're posting for URI.parse, the same URI that we had over there, just to make sure that we're posting to the correct endpoint so that this test will pass. We want to make sure that we're posting to that endpoint for the body. Kbase URL, we have to import this. And we have to make sure that the body will be JSON encode. And we want to make sure that it will have the same values as were passed in from the signature. And in this case, created at will simply be created at. Name will simply be name. And avatar will simply be avatar. And yet again, I fail to format. No, stop. Yes. Alright, so I think that's formatted now. Let's go ahead and are we returning properly? It completes successfully. Final response. If the response is 200, yes. So at this point, I don't even need to do this. We could save this for later after we write the test for the second part, testing when it's not 200 or 201. Let's see what happens. Fingers crossed. And there we have a failure. Register fallback value. Why? Oh, because URI. Remember, the URL is not a string, so we need to register a fallback value. Because at first I thought it would be a string, but it's a URI. So I'm just going to register a fallback value with a URI, just an empty URI with nothing in it. So let's see. And we have another failure. Complete successfully was not a future. Let me see. I think there's problems from here. Let me go ahead and remove this top level invocation and let's just invoke it and make sure that it completes successfully. Yeah, so now it passes. So we can see in this case we don't need the top level invocation over here. We actually do that when we're saying look, when someone or anyone calls this function on the right side, then verify that this or that or this or whatever we put here is true, right? But in this case, we actually want to call that function because we need to make sure that it completes successfully. So we just go ahead and invoke it without depending on some other outside functionality to call that function. So this is why it was failing. So we go ahead and invoke it. So also remember that I told you that this could work if you removed this and put its invocation here and then checked if that was equal to future value. That's a lie. That wouldn't work. I was totally lying. That wouldn't work. I actually thought that would work, but I'm thinking about it now because this actually has a return type of void. So if I actually went ahead and awaited for this, then this would fail. As you can see, it's a type of void, so you can't check if it was future value, right? So in that case, you would probably just have to obliterate this, pull this, and remove the expect, right? But if you actually want to make sure that it works and it completes, you can use the invocation without the top order calling. So you just invoke it yourself. So that's how this test would work. Let's go ahead and test for when it fails. So when it fails, something similar would happen. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's write a test. We want to make sure that it throws an API exception. Should throw API exception when the status code is not 200 or 201. We can actually go ahead and say when the status code is 400, but what if the status code was 500 or if it was something different? So in order to cover every base grammatically, I just prefer to say if the status code is not 200 or 201, then we probably want to throw an error with that same message, with the proper message. You can go ahead and add that with the right message, but that's basically what we're testing for. So when client.put, let me go ahead and hijack what we had up there. When the client.post gets called with anything at all, then answer. But we're not answering, we're answering with a response, because when there's an error from the server, the post request does not throw. It actually returns your response, but with a different status code, 400. Invalid email address. So in here we final method call. So whenever you're testing for the exceptions, whether it returns something or not. So when you're testing for this one, the reason why we did this way is because it doesn't return anything. When it returns void, you can do this or totally obliterate this and just await and call this function here like I've shown you before. You can rewind just a few seconds. But then whenever you're testing your exceptions, you do not want to invoke this in here. You always want to save the call. You save the call, and the call will be remote data source dot create user. We don't want this yet. You always want to save the call. Then you use a higher order function. So you expect that when a higher order function, in this case, we'll invoke it. So, but then when a higher order function calls the method call, because we're not going to be using its results because it's going to be throwing an error. This is why we don't need to remove this, because in this case, we had to remove this because we were invoking this in order to use its value to make sure or to check if it completed successfully. In this case, when you're checking to see if it throws an error, you want the higher order function to call this method. So you always want to put it this way. So you can also remove it though, but preferably I'd advise you to use it this way. So when a higher order function calls our method call, what do we want to do? We want to check that throws a. We want to make sure that it throws an API exception with the message saying invalid. We want to make sure that the message is the same. This is why it was important to extend equatable. Alright, so that way we know that the API, this will be correct only if the actual exception thrown from the create user is the same as this, if their message and status code are the same. And why will they be the same? Because the response that we've just hijacked for the server is saying this. So when it says that, we want to make sure that whatever is happening inside of the create user will return an API exception with the exact same message and the exact same status code. This is why equatable is important in your fake exception, not a fake exception, but in your custom exceptions. This is also why we want to create a custom exception for testing purpose. So let's go ahead and do that. Save this, comma, format, save this much. That should work. Add constant. And now we need to add second comma and format. Beautiful. So we want to make sure that whenever this gets called, that it throws an API exception. Where does that end? It ends here, and then we want to verify that the client.post actually got called of the correct data. So let's go ahead and copy these over because it's just going to be the same thing. So we want to make sure that that gets called. When we run this test, it will fail because we're still in the red phase. So let's go ahead and put that in the green phase. Let's go ahead and start. No, not here. It should be over here. But bing. So first of all, let's save that response. So let's go ahead and check client post final. Sorry, if response.status code is not equal to 200 and response.status code is not equal to 201, then throw a server an API exception with the message from the response.body, and the status code will be from the response.status code. The body is a string. So let's go ahead. Some servers would return you the message with a map or like a data map. So you have to decode it and then extract the message from inside of it. So in that case, you can just do the same JSON decode and then you extract it. So inside of this place, if your server does that, you also want to mock that as well. You want to be able to pass in a map in here and put this in maybe a key value pair, and then make sure that it extracts the proper thing in here. So let's go ahead and do that over here. If response.status code is that, we want to make sure that we throw an API exception, comma. Let's test that and see if it works. That did not work at all. Let's see what's the problem. Let's go ahead and wait for this to complete. Async. Let me see if that fixes it. Oh my. I didn't invoke this. Oh my. I'm so sorry. I did not invoke that at all. Go ahead and invoke this. Where is it? There you are. Method invocation. Let's see if that fixes it. Yes, so I'm so sorry. That was an oversight. So this is how this testing would work. So now this works. However, in here, imagine if we had a Dart error. So we've totally tested and considered every server type error in here.